Okay, so I saw your interview on the theory of everything with Kurt Jaimungal. Great show. He's great. And 3 hours worth of stuff. So I was able to go through that. He's a tough act to follow. But I was able to go through and kind of find things that I wanted to kind of hone in on a little bit more. And then
Oh,
also, I also am trying to construct the storyline. I mean, I know that there's all this information that's popping up from different spheres, and it's complicated and whatnot. But there's somewhere in here there's a human tale about a bunch of people deciding that something that's a secret needs to become public, and I'm talking about the
sure.
the whistleblowers. So one proposition I want to put to you is that it seems to me that the people who were on the UAP task force, and we know who a few of them are. There's Travis Taylor. There's David Grusch. There's the guy that Travis Taylor knows, his former boss.
Jay Stratton.
Yeah, Jay Stratton. Um, am I wrong in thinking that the task force discovered some really meaty, interesting things, and as a result, that's partly what's pushing this momentum forward?
No, you're not wrong. In fact, the difference between the UAPTF, the UAP Task Force, and the current ARRO, the All Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, apart from the fact that ARRO is a ridiculously named acronym, is the fact that ARRO is reactive. It relies on essentially people coming to it, witnesses coming to it. Whereas the UAPTF tasked David Grusch with being proactive. He was told, he was given a few clues and told to go out and start investigating. And that's why he achieved the breakthroughs that he achieved, because essentially, I don't think the gatekeepers, if there are gatekeepers, and I suspect there are, I don't think they expected the Pentagon's UAP unit to be quite so aggressive in asking the question. Mr. Grusch discovered very early on, when he started talking to friends of his with whom he shared similarly high security clearances, that to his surprise, when they realized he was interested in the program, even though he was a determined skeptic and not a believer in the phenomenon of UAPs, he discovered that there really was this parallel secret program hidden within Pentagon special access programs that was, he believes, being illegally and perhaps criminally withheld from the knowledge of the Congress.
Yeah. So I mean, to that in relation to that, is there? I mean, are there people behind Grush right now in terms of also helping to encourage these other whistleblowers to step forward after they see what happens to David Grush in terms of public reaction?
There are certainly other whistleblowers or potential witnesses who are looking at coming forward. Some of them have already testified on behalf of Mr. Grush. This is one of the points that a lot of people do not understand. A lot of misinformed debunker, skeptics, propagandists are basically asserting that Mr. Grush has provided no evidence. That's not true. Mr. Grush has actually provided an enormous amount of evidence. It's just that his security oath forbids him from revealing it to you and me, because we are mere mortals. We don't have a top secret SCI clearance. What he's done is he's provided the evidence that he collected, some of it in documentary form, but also in the form of first-hand witnesses who've come forward to the Inspector General of the intelligence community and to the two key oversight committees of Congress, the House Permanent Select Committee for Intelligence and the Senate Select Committee for Intelligence. And those two key congressional oversight committees, on the admission of Senator Marco Rubio in an interview with News Nation last week,
Absolutely. Yes.
Senator Rubio admitted, and again, people miss this point, that Mr. Rubio, Senator Rubio, admitted that there are first-hand witnesses who have come forward in the past 2 years providing evidence that essentially corroborates a lot of what David Grush has put to the Congress. So we're already in a situation where the Congress already has evidence. And one of the things that's been consistently misinterpreted by the propagandists and agitprop people who are determined to try and stop Mr. Grush's evidence from being properly heard is they've pushed this canard, this fake line that there is no evidence, when in fact there is an abundance of evidence. There are first-hand witnesses who have come forward from the so-called legacy program. What I have expressed skepticism about is whether the Congress has the political will to allow the evidence that it already has to be publicly released. That's not a reflection on the validity or the strength of that evidence. I think the evidence, if it's based on the people that I've spoken to, and I know some people have come forward to the Congress, I'm not entirely sure which ones have, but I've spoken to people inside the legacy program, people who purport to have been part of secret attempts to reverse engineer non-human technology. And they tell me that they are very happy to come forward and give evidence in the right circumstances. But I think a lot of them are waiting to see what happens to Mr. Grusch. There's already a determined propaganda campaign, a disinformation campaign being run on the web by scallywags and, frankly, propagandists from certain sections of social media.
We all know
and their aim seems to be to pull this attempt down. But the simple fact is all Mr. Grusch wants is to be given the opportunity to be heard, preferably in a public hearing. And that's hopefully what's going to happen in the next few weeks.
That's what's interesting to me is that, I mean, he's not claiming that we need to accept all of this on his own, testimony. He's saying, let's investigate it. And it seems like there's nothing to lose in that. I mean, at worst, we would dispel this 70 years of misinformation and rumor that's been flying around. And at best, I guess it could be also the worst, find this program that has been hidden from American voters for generations.
Look, frankly, James, if it's true, as the Pentagon asserts, that there is no evidence of ET contact with this planet, as people have said to the Congress, people from very senior levels in the intelligence community. If that's true, here's their opportunity to absolutely, completely, once and for all, wipe the floor with the allegation. What they can do is give David Grusch the opportunity to testify. What they can do is give the first-hand witnesses the opportunity to testify in public hearings. Let's see that evidence tested. If this is all nonsense, David Grusch, on his own admission, has given this evidence under oath. So if he's lied, and if it can be proven to a court that he's intentionally perjured himself, he's exposed himself to the risk of criminal prosecution. Yeah. Now ask yourself, why would a former senior intelligence officer, somebody who until April was working at the highest levels of the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, why would he take that risk to come out and make false claims both to the Inspector General of the intelligence community and to the Congress if there wasn't some substance to it? And as indeed Michael Schellenberger, the noted journalist, has also noted in the last 24 hours, the Inspector General of the intelligence community has verified Mr. Grusch's claims, his allegations, to be credible and urgent. And yet again, the propagandists have leapt in and tried to assert that all the Inspector General was basing his impressions on were on Mr. Grusch's allegations of reprisals. And I know that's not the case. Yeah. The Inspector General has done an intense investigation into the broader issue of whether or not there is a crash retrieval and reverse engineering program that has been improperly, illegally withheld from the knowledge of the Congress and the relevant oversight committees. And what was the Inspector General's determination? His determination was that Mr. Grusch's allegations were credible and urgent, and that's why he referred his allegations to the congressional committees. So here is an opportunity, once and for all, good on the Pentagon. Here's an opportunity for the Pentagon to wipe the floor with David Grusch. Put up or shut up. I completely agree. Let's give Mr. Grusch the opportunity to put his evidence before the public. What a great moment to definitively prove that the Pentagon has been falsely slurred all these years.
Yeah,
and that
Roswell
it's been a victim
was
of
just a balloon.
A wicked social media disinformation program. I feel sorry for these poor generals and Air Force commanders who've presided over allegations of a cover-up. I feel so sorry for them, because here's the opportunity now for them to correct the record. Here's the opportunity for them to fulsomely embrace this opportunity for the Congress, the ultimate sovereign in the United States, to basically show determinatively, once and for all, that there's absolutely no truth to the notion that the US Congress is being deceived by the military or the intelligence community. What a great opportunity. And I really applaud, frankly, I really applaud the Pentagon for its open-mindedness on this, because here is a unique opportunity. Here is a fantastic opportunity for the relevant arms of the military to embrace and welcome this opportunity to clear their name.
Can I ask you two questions about the Inspector General stuff? There's so there's these investigations, and they determine his complaint to be credible and urgent, and they send it on to Congress. As far as I know, that doesn't have to be it with Inspector Generals. If people in the intelligence community or within the Pentagon did things that are illegal, that can evolve into a criminal investigation, correct? Is that ongoing, and do you know the status of what that investigation looks like at this point?
All I know, my friend, is that the Inspector General investigation is ongoing. Okay. And Mr. Grusch has made serious criminal allegations. You don't get many more serious allegations than the sort of allegations of criminality that Mr. Grusch has made to me in the News Nation interview.
Did you make any? Is there specifics?
You know the thing I find amazing about
whatever?
This, James?
Yeah.
The thing I find absolutely amazing is the American media were led, and indeed I myself as an Australian media representative, were led by the nose by the intelligence community back in 2002, 2003. And we were told definitively that there were absolutely superb sources who could verify that Iraq was developing weapons of mass destruction. And we were told it was an absolute national security imperative that your country and mine had to be part of the coalition to invade Iraq and to rid the world of the nuclear or biological weapons that Saddam Hussein was developing in secret. All of this was based on alleged source evidence that the intelligence community assured journalists like myself they should believe. You know what? It was a complete lie. And if they'd done their homework, they would have known it was a complete lie. Their source was a dud. Here you have a situation, almost the exact opposite, where a man from within the intelligence community is going on the record definitively asserting that he has discovered things that are being improperly, if not criminally, withheld from the proper oversight of your Congress. And the incredible thing is, the same media that was so slavishly willing to believe the assurances of intelligence officials about anonymous sources that led us into a $2 trillion war are now reluctant to engage with an intelligence official who has the courage to come forward and state what he believes is the truth. At the very least, he deserves a hearing. And as much as the squealing little debunkers and the rabid little propagandists are reluctant to hear it, it looks like he's going to finally get the opportunity to put his evidence before the Congress in a public way. And then we'll really see who's right.
Yeah, it's both Senate and the House are looking at hearings, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's the Senate Armed Services Committee and the House Oversight Committee. Mm-hmm. And as well as that, don't forget that there are concurrent ongoing investigations inside the House Permanent Select Committee for Intelligence and also the Senate Select Committee for Intelligence. I wouldn't be surprised at all if at some stage both or one of those committees decides to take up the cudgels as well. Because really all you need are one or two other corroborative witnesses who come forward and say, yeah, I actually agree with Mr. Grusch. This is true. This is real. And I do think there's a high possibility that that will happen. A lot depends really on the way that Mr. Grusch is treated by Congress. Is the Congress really willing to see this exposed?
Well, I would say so far that he's been treated pretty well by Congress, hasn't he? Or would you say otherwise?
Well, he's been given the opportunity to give private hearings.
Mm-hmm.
And I was a bit disheartened. I gave an interview to Kurt Jaimungal, as you know, a week or so ago, well before Senator Marco Rubio made his public comments. And I was getting very disheartened that there wasn't any senior official from either side of politics speaking out in support of Mr. Grusch's attempts to get this properly investigated by Congress. But I'm really heartened. I'm truly delighted to see that Senator Marco Rubio has shown the political courage to come forward as has Senator Kirsten Gillibrand. Both sides of politics. This is enormous. This is the moment when Congress is basically split party-wise on most issues.
On everything.
all of a sudden, Congress has discovered bipartisanship on one issue. Probably the most controversial issue anywhere in the world is the issue of allegations of unidentified anomalous phenomena. Why would Senator Kirsten Gillibrand from the Democrat side, why would Senator Marco Rubio from the Republican side, why would they stick their heads up and risk public vilification on this if they didn't already know something from within their Senate Select Committee, which basically suggests to them that this is real?
They both want to be president as well. So they're getting out in front of something major, I think.
This is why this is absurd. This is why the silly little debate on social media where you've got propagandist debunkers who are trying to sort of take the wind out of Grusch's sails before he gets the chance to have a say. This is why it's so ridiculous. Why would senior politicians commit themselves publicly to a proper and full, rigorous investigation into Mr. Grusch's claims if they didn't already know something? Exactly. I'm telling you, mate, they do. They already know something. They've already seen and heard from witnesses, first-hand witnesses. And so this is where it's getting really disingenuous because, frankly, I know the politicians in those key committees in Congress already know a great deal. I know Tim Burchett knows a great deal on the House Oversight Committee because Tim's already been spoken to by people I'm speaking to. Mm-hmm. He's been approached by witnesses who want to give their evidence, first-hand witnesses. Republican Mike Gallagher, he showed great political courage the other day. Yeah. Oh, sorry, I start again. I apologize. Mike Gallagher's a Democrat, isn't he? I apologize.
It was Gallagher, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was Gallagher. Yeah. Is he a Dem or a Republican? I've forgotten.
Gallagher is a Republican.
He's a Republican. So I was right first time. Yeah. I mean, Republican Mike Gallagher, again, he's shown political leadership doing what he's done. Mm-hmm. I mean, the simple fact is we've now got bipartisanship in both houses of the Congress. Sorry about that. We've now got bipartisanship on both houses of the Congress, which are willing to investigate this matter. And that's special. That's really important. So really, I don't give a flying toss about the fizz and bubble on social media. It's irrelevant. The main game now is in Congress. The main game now is for Congress to decide, is it going to allow a public airing of the very serious criminal allegations that are being made by David Grusch? And is he going to be allowed to bring up corroborative witnesses who can back what he claims? Mm-hmm. That's the test.
One question sorry, go ahead. Didn't mean to interrupt you. But one question I did have, you mentioned Jake Sullivan. Are you okay?
Yeah, I'm fine. Yeah, I'm just muting my watch. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Jake Sullivan, obviously the National Security Advisor. And you mentioned during your interview with Kurt that he had been present, I guess, at one of the Senate briefings. And also he started this UAP task force, and not the UAP task force, but another UAP task force within, I guess, the White House after the balloon gate or whatever you want to call it. Is there a chance that could be the sleeper in this, or the dark horse? Like, could they decide to reveal more if it turned out to be politically advantageous or whatever?
James, one of the things governments do when they're under pressure, and the government of your country was under enormous pressure at the time of the multiple alleged balloon shoot downs in February. Mm-hmm. And what they often do is they announce an inquiry. They normally give it a really big name, so that they might call it a task force. So they call it a task force, and then basically the public is assured, we've got a task force looking into this. Don't you worry, your tiny little heads. We're on this. And haven't you noticed how the Biden White House has gone so quiet since that alleged task force was established? We're not hearing any results from it, and there has not been any report from either the National Security Council spokesperson or Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor himself. What I am aware of, and I can only speak very carefully here because I have to protect my sources, is that I am aware that Mr. Sullivan has attended a meeting in the Senate where crash retrievals and reverse engineering programs were discussed before senators.
Okay.
It was kept very, very secret. And I know he attended. And what's interesting is why the White House hasn't been pushed. For example, one reporter made an attempt to question Karine Jean-Pierre in a White House press briefing. What did she do? She just passed.
Yeah.
She completely ducked the story. She ducked the question. She said, you'll have to ask the Pentagon. Why, when the White House, when the president was being asked what he knows, what his National Security Council advisor knows, why did he buck pass to the Pentagon?
Yeah.
Why should we? Why should the executive branch of government be buck passing to an agency that is completely subordinate to the president? The president is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, on my understanding of your constitution.
Yep.
Why did media sitting in the room not realize the constitutional significance of what the White House press secretary did at that stage?
Could you run us through what you would have done in that circumstance?
I would have pressed the question. I would have said, no, I'm sorry, we're asking you on behalf of the president. What does the president know?
Yeah.
That's the most important question right now.
Absolutely.
What does the president know? And Karine Jean-Pierre, God bless her, she buck passed the question to the Pentagon.
Which is suspicious. I mean, the whole thing is suspicious.
Why is the Pentagon buck passing this question, this key question? Sorry, why is the president buck passing this key question to the Pentagon? Can I also make the point that in your district, in your area of California, there are some of the world's biggest aerospace companies, and one of them is Lockheed Martin.
Yeah.
And I only see the symmetry here because it's very similar to what happened with the White House. Yeah. Because when Lockheed Martin was recently approached by a journalist and asked whether or not it was in possession of retrieved non-human technology, what did it do?
Arrow.
It could have easily resolved the question. It could have said, no, of course not. This is a crazy journalistic story. You know, this is some specious conspiracy theory that's being circulated on social media. What did it do? It buck passed to the Pentagon. Yeah. So now you have the President of the United States and one of the biggest defense contractors in the United States, when asked a question about alleged non-human intelligence, when asked a question about whether there have been crash retrievals and reverse engineering programs, what do? Well, both the President and Lockheed Martin, they buck pass to the Pentagon. All I can say, James, is who's running your country? Is the president in charge? Is Lockheed Martin in charge?
Closer. Yeah, about the Lockheed stuff. I mean, you've mentioned them repeatedly. Are there any other companies that we should be aware of who might be in the same game? I mean, which ones?
Yes, there are.
Could you name those as well, or is that not?
No. That's the subject of my continuing investigations, and you will be seeing more from this from me in due course.
Okay.
But essentially, it's time other journalists started doing their homework. The evidence is there. As I wrote in my book, the evidence is in plain sight, which is the title of my book. Yeah. I've often thought that if a bit of rigorous investigative journalism was applied, especially in your neck of the woods in Northern California, where there are a lot of very interesting companies, I think you would find a lot of very interesting connections.
Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned a little bit about intellectual property, and you were talking about how whether or not if a company was given some material back in the 50s or 60s or whatever else, and if they basically have developed products off of that, about how the intellectual property would work. I'm not a lawyer at all, but I was wondering about like fruit of the poisoned tree kind of arguments, where if a company was given technology from the government who had recovered it, and they didn't bid for anything and they didn't put it out and there was no official projects, other companies, I think, would be able to complain and ultimately sue based on antitrust laws because they were put at a competitive disadvantage. Am I wrong in that?
Well, I don't know about antitrust. I'm not familiar with your antitrust laws. I trained as a lawyer, as an attorney before I went into journalism, and I'm familiar with intellectual property law. What I think might very well be a meritorious argument to provide a legal case and a legal basis to challenge a company like Lockheed Martin, which is a publicly listed company, is what have they done to protect shareholder value on this? How much money has been spent of shareholder money on developing reverse engineered technology that may in fact have not presented any return for shareholders? And has this been properly disclosed under corporate disclosure? Because one of the things that public companies in your country are under is extraordinarily good laws. Your SEC, your Securities Exchange Commission, has some of the best corporate disclosure laws in the world. And that's because of shocking scandals like Enron and other corporate collapses, the absolutely appalling mortgage finance collapses across the US at the time of the last crash.
Yeah,
there's fantastic laws in your NEC which basically require shareholders to be advised about anything that is material to the company's share price. So yeah, I've named Lockheed Martin because I do believe there is strong evidence to suggest that Lockheed Martin is in possession of reverse engineered technology that it has not disclosed to its shareholders. Now, it may very well be that they can argue that this will eventually add value to the material share price of Lockheed Martin. But for how many decades have they been spending shareholder money on things that have been misallocated, misidentified within the public budgets of Lockheed Martin? Because shareholders have a right to know. Absolutely. They're the people paying for the company. So I don't know whether it's an antitrust issue, but it's certainly an issue of corporate disclosure to shareholders. And I would have thought any shareholder of Lockheed Martin has the right to stand up at an annual general meeting or to write a letter to the chief executive of Lockheed Martin and demand to know, are there material ongoing secret programs involving non-human technology that have been being worked on by Lockheed Martin? How much money of shareholders' money has been spent on developing those programs? What kind of return on investment has been made? And if this is true, why hasn't this been properly disclosed by Lockheed Martin, which, after all, even though it's a defense behemoth, it's still a public corporation that is obliged to report to its shareholders. And look, I've searched the files of corporate disclosures by Lockheed Martin. There is no corporate disclosure about reverse engineered technology, and neither would I expect that there would be. Mm-hmm. But they're not allowed to hide things inside line budgets. They have to still disclose. And this is materially important to their share price.
Absolutely. One question I had that sort of linked back with something earlier, in terms of the threats that were placed against Mr. Grusch, were they coming from private industry or were they coming from the Pentagon?
I can't specify.
Okay. Now, did you...
But just so you know, the issue of threats and harassment, they formed the basis of Mr. Grusch's reprisal complaint to the Inspector General of the Intelligence Community. And just to reaffirm, it was the Inspector General of the Intelligence Community who affirmed that he found Mr. Grusch's allegations of reprisal, along with all his other allegations, to be substantiated enough for him to make a finding that they were credible and urgent. So this isn't some wild allegation made by Mr. Grusch. This is an allegation that has been supported by the Inspector General of the Intelligence Community of the United States.
Well, and honestly, if he was telling a bunch of ghost stories, they wouldn't want to there would be no threat of reprisal.
Absolutely.
The fact that there were threats sort of validates what he's saying has some merit.
Yeah.
Did you happen to catch the Ezra Klein interview with Leslie Kean?
I read the transcript. I didn't watch it. I found it too painful to watch because it was characteristic of the sneering dismissiveness of the New York Times' position on this issue. Yeah. The great paper, the great newspaper, the Grey Lady that used to be fearless has become a bit of a pussy when it comes to dealing with the subject of UAPs. It's gone very meek and very mute, sadly.
Yeah. One issue in there that he mentioned that I thought maybe other people might want to clarify it, or maybe just a little bit more of explanation. It's DOPSR, right? Like that's the body that reviews whether or not something that you're going to talk about in public is going to violate classification rules or whatever. Sure. As far as people have said, this idea of there being a reverse engineering program is classified. So why would DOPSR approve it? Their argument is that, well, since DOPSR approved it, it must be nonsense because they wouldn't let something that's classified get revealed in that way. Do you have any insight into what DOPSR's thinking was in terms of letting him go forward with, claiming the program exists? Wouldn't that itself be classified?
I can't speak for DOPSR, of course. I don't know what motivated their decision to allow Mr. Grusch to make the statements that he made. Mm-hmm. And just to reiterate, as you know, DOPSR, when it approves an interview, when it approves the things that Mr. Grusch said he wanted to say, it's not an endorsement that what he's saying is true. And I know you understand that. But I think the best explanation that I can think of, and this is what's been put to me by those in the know, is that DOPSR was attempting to contain Mr. Grusch's comments because essentially it knows that sooner or later, Mr. Grusch's allegations are going to be ventilated in the Congress, mm-hmm. because it's quite clear from the comments from Senator Marco Rubio that the, quote, first-hand witnesses who are senior people in the US government with high security classifications who have given evidence that verifies some of what Mr. Grusch asserts. They have already given evidence in the previous 2 years. Mr. Grusch gave his evidence relatively recently. But these people have come forward over 2 years.
So Grusch isn't even... Grusch wouldn't even be the revelation.
So can I just finish my answer?
Sorry, yeah, please.
My answer is that knowing that those senior people with senior security classifications and seniority inside the intelligence and defense community, knowing that those people on Senator Marco Rubio's admission have come forward over the past 2 years and given evidence in secret to the Congress, I think the DOPSR is an acknowledgement that this is going to come out and that what they're trying to do is restrain Mr. Grusch from revealing too much within his security oath at the moment, knowing that it will be for the determination of Congress how much is eventually revealed in public hearings. Okay. But frankly, my friend, it was game over once Senator Marco Rubio made the statements that he made. The senator acknowledged that there are now first-hand witnesses from within the defense and intelligence establishment who have corroborated issues that Mr. Grusch has raised as allegations. Moreover, these are people with high security classifications working at senior levels in the US government. It doesn't get any more serious than that. Absolutely. And so if you view the DOPSR response to Mr. Grusch's request to do an interview in that context, does the Defense Department want to be put in the position of subsequently being accused by the Congress of restraining an honorable, decent man like David Grusch from speaking publicly about something that is true and already verified by the Congress? DOPSR knows it's game over. Yeah. This is the thing that a lot of people don't realize. It's game over, guys. The Defense Department knows it's already out. The Congress already knows. The big issue, and I keep on saying this, and there are certain propagandist debunkers who keep on misrepresenting what I say, the issue now is, will the Congress facilitate Mr. Grusch and all the other witnesses to go public with what they know? That's the big issue. Mm-hmm. And people have said that I'm saying that I'm skeptical about that because I'm pessimistic about the evidence having validity. I'm not pessimistic about the evidence at all. I know that witnesses have come forward with first-hand evidence of the UAP program. I know that witnesses have come forward with the names of people running the program, with the code names that actually dominate and control this program, and with the locations of alleged craft. What isn't clear yet is whether the Congress is going to mandate the release of that information in a public hearing. We're getting all sorts of good noises, and I'm certainly very positive after hearing Senator Marco Rubio's comments and Representative Gallagher's comments last week.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I think we all still have to wait and see. Are the House Oversight Committee and is the Senate Armed Services Committee going to be allowed to ask the hard questions? And will the witnesses be allowed to testify in open public hearing, or will their evidence be kept in camera in a secure SCIF? And will the public ever get to know? And where I'm pessimistic is whether the public will ever get to know. I'm not pessimistic about the strength of the evidence. I know the evidence is strong. The issue is there a willingness by the Congress to allow that evidence to become public?
Yeah. Talking about Jim Comer, he's the chairman of the Oversight Committee. He had this weird comment about background checks on some of the witnesses. Did you see that? And would you know anything about what that is?
Yeah, I do know that there's been a large number of witnesses that have come forward. Some of them have come forward from Dr. Stephen Greer's Disclosure Project organisation. And I think that the people that might have been weeded out included people from that group. I'm told that there are no witnesses in support of Mr. Grusch who have been excluded, but I'm happy to be proved wrong on that point.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. That's important. Let's see here.
But can I also make the point?
Please.
It's been explained to me, even though a lot of people have some very negative opinions of Dr. Stephen Greer, including myself, I've got strong doubts about some of the assertions that he's made in the past. I understand that he has actually provided some highly credible witnesses to Congress, and that those witnesses are indeed people with knowledge of the... Sorry. I apologize.
Okay.
I understand that some of those people that have come forward are people with direct knowledge of the legacy UAP program. So it's a kind of an odd mix what Mr. Greer has provided to the Congress. I don't think he's been as discriminating as perhaps he ought to have been in providing witnesses to give evidence. And when I think Representative Comer has made these comments, I think that, yes, sure, there'll always be a culling of some witnesses, but my understanding is that none of those witnesses that have been culled are witnesses that are people who are substantiating what Mr. Grusch says.
Absolutely. I appreciate that again. One of the questions that I have, and you've mentioned this before, that there were things that Mr. Grusch has told you that are alarming, keep you up at night. So my question, I guess, is have the most dramatic and or alarming moments from either of your interviews with David Grusch been released?
Well, let me just say it like this. I'm aware of things more broadly than what I've been informed about by Mr. Grusch.
Okay.
And I've spoken extensively to people who purport to have knowledge of certain issues that are highly classified within the US government. And yeah, I'm really concerned about some of the things that I've been told. Not only do they reflect criminally on certain US government agencies, they also, I think, show that there's been a completely unreasonable cover-up by people at the highest levels of the defense and intelligence community to improperly withhold information from the knowledge of the American public and indeed the world. And if the allegations are true, and I preface everything I say by saying if those allegations are true, this is why we're really now at the stage, James, where there does need to be a kind of a church commission style inquiry, an open public hearing where top secret SCI clearances are waived and where witnesses can speak with absolute impunity and know that they will be protected if they give their evidence. Because as Senator Rubio admitted, I mean, I couldn't, the one moment in the Senator Rubio interview with News Nation where I almost fell over was where he acknowledged that witnesses are frightened and that they've been threatened and that in some cases, in some cases, they fear for their lives. And as you say, I mean, Matthew Phelan from the Daily Mail did a write-up on the full transcript of what Senator Rubio said. And he did. He referred to a shadow government within the government. That's reflective of comments that were made speculatively by the renowned Hawaiian Senator Daniel Inouye many years ago. Yeah. Comments that were widely dismissed at the time as hysterical conspiracy nonsense. Now you've got a very senior Republican senator, the vice chairman of the Senate Select Committee for Intelligence, on the record asserting a shadow government within a government. Yeah. Asserting that people are frightened to the extent that they've been threatened with their lives. What's going on? What don't we know?
So just to be clear then, the things that you know that most alarm you have to do with our government and the reaction rather than the other. Is that right? Is that fair to say?
I don't want to unnecessarily alarm people, but no, there are aspects of the phenomenon that I find quite alarming and scary that I've been told about. I don't want to speak publicly about them because I haven't been able to confirm them.
Sure.
But it involves bad things being done to human beings.
Yeah.
And frankly, if they're true, they're deeply alarming and concerning. Yeah. One thing I would draw your attention to is one of the things that Mr. Grusch was able to speak about on a limited basis in the DOPSA agreement that the Defense Department authorized him to speak about was agreements. And when I put to him that this involved implicitly agreements with non-human intelligence, he didn't disagree with me. Yeah. And that's where I would be looking.
I would mention that there's long been UFO lore that there was an agreement made in the past where the United States would get technology in exchange for being able to test on American citizens. I have no idea if that's what you're talking about, but that's in that direction. Some journalism questions. I admire you. I think you've done a fantastic job with this. I admire your strength and clarity on all of it. There's an interesting thing I've heard Leslie Kean say about the bodies issue in the story. Like she basically is like, oh, we didn't talk about bodies, like hands up, back away, like somehow that would be toxic. And my read on it is if you have a subject and he's telling you a bunch of information, and if you have no role necessarily in picking and choosing which information to include because you don't know if your readers or the publicators could handle it. And I'm not saying that's what she did, but I mean, would there be any circumstance where you would not include bodies that he told you about because of the reaction to that, or any thoughts on that whole issue?
James, all I can say is that when David Grusch told me that there were retrieved non-human craft, the next obvious question in my book as a journalist was, were their bodies recovered? I mean, we all know, anyone who's a student of the history of these allegations knows that there are claims that bodies have been recovered from incidents such as the Roswell incident. I personally investigated the Aztec story, I think in 1948, where allegedly 15 bodies were recovered. So, of course, the first thing I was going to ask was, are there bodies? And I was astonished when Mr. Grusch admitted to me that, yes, there are bodies. Now, I think you'd have to ask Leslie and Ralph why they didn't, on their admission, ask about bodies. I for the life of me, don't know why they wouldn't ask that question, but that's up to them.
Yeah. Another question I have is that you've had a stellar career in terms of, the things that you've covered, the places you've been, awards and whatnot. Do you feel like at this point that your reputation is at stake with the outcome of this story? If it all turns out to be
ultimately, what's not at stake is my reputation. What's at stake is the sacrosanct. Let me answer this properly. It's not my reputation that's at stake as a journalist. All I'm doing is reporting what Mr. Grusch and other sources have told me. That's what journalists do. It's our obligation to report evidence as we see and weigh it objectively and present it in news. That's what I've done. What is at stake is the reputation of your Congress, of your government, because we're at a really interesting moment in history where I don't think there's ever been such a senior intelligence officer go public with such incredible criminal allegations. And I don't think the American oversight processes are set up to deal with it. The Congress is so riven at the moment. It's so stricken with divisiveness on so many issues. We're still cutting each other in half over the January 6th insurrection. But the one thing that I noticed that the Congress is showing bipartisanship on is this issue of UAPs. And the reason why, and this appears lost on so many people in the public, is that the Congress has been holding secret hearings on UAPs now for years. They've already heard a lot of the evidence that is not yet in the public domain. I think there are congressmen and senators who already know about the existence of a legacy UAP crash retrieval program. So the only reputation that's at stake is the reputation of the Congress, because, as I've said repeatedly, I'm very pessimistic that there's the political will in the current international environment for the truth to be revealed. I've spoken to sources. I've spoken to multiple sources who've told me what's going on. And the reason why I feel strongly that there is a truth that is being withheld from the world on this issue is because in journalism, as you know, you get to a certain point with multiple corroborative witnesses where you're really left in no doubt that this isn't some disinformation program. This isn't some black operation to try and mislead me, to try and disguise black American technology. There is a reality there. Now, the extent of what I've been told, to the extent that it's true, that can't be verified by me. I'm not in a position to use a top secret SCI clearance to kick the door in at Groom Lake or wherever these things are hidden and verify. But what I can tell you is that there are multiple sources, including David Grusch, who've told me about the existence of a legacy crash retrieval and reverse engineering program. So, frankly, if it all turns out to be bunkum, what it means then, the only other plausible explanation is that the United States has been developing technology in the black, which is mind-blowing, because it's a matter of fact now that there is technology showing what's called the 5 observables, extraordinary speeds, including possibly superluminal speed, faster than light speed, instantaneous velocity, transmedium travel, stealth mode, and possibly most important of all, anti-gravitic propulsion, positive lift. Somebody is displaying those technologies in our aerospace. That's the significance of what's going on at the moment. Ever since the New York Times, God bless her little soul, broke the story back in 2017 that there is a new reality, that the Pentagon has been investigating the phenomenon of UAPs, that they're real, and that you cannot dismiss these anomalous objects and explain them away prosaically as weather phenomenon or some kind of secret technology. As soon as senior people in your government started admitting that this is not known American technology, the obvious question is, whose is it? So if it does turn out that David Grusch is discredited and there is no legacy UAP retrieval program and that it's all American technology, the awesome thing is, it's American.
American technology. Yeah,
I know. That's the only other explanation.
Yeah.
Either that or it's Russian or Chinese. And God forbid if that's the case, because I think if it was, we'd already know.
Yeah,
they would
Ukraine
have used
would
it
be a
offensively.
whole different thing. Yeah, you mentioned reputations, though. I think that the reputation of the Pentagon is at stake. The reputation of the Gray Lady, all of mainstream media. It's not just. There's a lot of reputation at risk if this doesn't get handled properly. One question I have, the last question, I guess. Thank you so much for giving me the time to do this. This has been a pleasure. But, we're living in an age of misinformation. And I think that, I'm wondering if you agree that the problem that some of the reticence in terms of jumping on this story by some of the mainstream media outlets is the rash of sort of wild claims that have been released in the public sphere over the past 10 years. You have the election lies, about whether or not the election was stolen. You have QAnon. You have all these various, I'm going to go ahead and say that I think that the anti-vax stuff was, to a large degree, misinformation. I'm sure I'll get some comments on that. But my point is that there is this avalanche of material, and it seems like social media has kind of created this environment where this stuff is encouraged. My question is, we've had only 10, 15 years to kind of prepare for this and get used to this, but what do we have to do in order to make sure that when something that sounds on the surface outlandish comes out and we all have to deal with it, it's like, because we were all trying to be extra critical and have these, like, we're not going to be fooled by crap on the internet, we miss it. And that could potentially be debilitating. Do you have any thoughts on that? Or
I do. I mean, I think I've already said elsewhere, I'm a student of history. So I'm fascinated with the Nixon Watergate era. And I had the privilege once of meeting Bob Woodward. And one of the things that fascinated me was how nobody back in the 1970s could have contemplated that a president would authorize a bunch of burglars, ex-CIA thugs, to go and burgle the offices of the DNC. Nobody could have anticipated a conspiracy whereby the CIA was authorized to go out and assassinate world leaders. I mean, some shocking things came out as a result of the Church Commission in the 1970s. So yes, I can understand that there are very confronting things that do deserve to be skeptically treated with extremely careful, objective analysis. And I can understand there's a reticence in the news media, in the mainstream media. And I feel a large amount of sympathy for it, to be perfectly honest, because I've been a beneficiary of working in the mainstream media for much of my career. And what people don't realize is that even great journalistic institutions like the Times, the Post, and a lot of the great television networks in America, they're no longer operating with the budgets that they used to have to authorize somebody like me to go out and kick the door in and start investigating. I mean, I've done 5 years work on this. I've done pretty much nothing else for 5 years. James, I started out a determined skeptic. I was writing on national security and terrorism issues. I'd covered wars with our military and your military in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I pretty smugly assumed that what lay behind the phenomenon of UAPs was very likely to be provably demonstrable to be some kind of new technology. I'm a fan of Nick Cook's book, The Hunt for Zero Point.
Absolutely.
Nick spent a lot of time in the 80s investigating the possibility that there was some kind of secret US technology that had been developed. And I guess I started out in this investigation thinking that I was going to find at the bottom of the rainbow some kind of new secret aerospace program that was being hidden from the public. And I think, frankly, if that's the case, that would have been a really good news story. What instead I discovered was that people in your defense and intelligence community were saying to me, you know what, this isn't ours. Or if it is ours, it's something that's so incredibly hidden that even I don't know about it and I should know about it. And so multiple people have given evidence saying that there is no such technology in the arsenal of the United States that's showing what these UAP are doing in our aerospace. And yet these UAP are real. Something is demonstrating the 5 observables in our aerospace. You know, it's beyond doubt now, even on the admission of your government, that there is anomalous phenomena that is doing weird things, apparently intelligently controlled, that is showing no visible means of propulsion, showing maneuvers and velocities that are far beyond known terrestrial science. Somebody, someone is doing this. Something is doing this. And the intriguing thing is, we've got this weird thing where a lot of the media are showing no curiosity. And yes, they've got every right to feel burned after the nonsense allegations of QAnon and conspiracy theories, the Clinton pizza parlor allegations. An enormous amount of nonsense has been spewed in social media that I think has allowed people to question whether we're living in a post-truth world. And that's why, yes, media, myself included, have to show objective rigor. I'm happy to be proved wrong. But I've set out in 5 years of digging to try to verify whether this is US technology. And you know what? As far as I can tell, it's not officially US technology. I still hold out the possibility that there is a hidden program in some private aerospace company that's working with anti-gravitic propulsion. But it's certainly not official. Enough officials have gone on the record now to say that this is not official. So prima facie, on the evidence, on the admissions of the US government, there is a technology manifesting itself to humanity that we cannot explain. That's the point, I think, at which media curiosity should be twigged. Because when you have a senior intelligence official like a David Grusch coming out of the woodwork, and we are now weeks into his public revelations, don't you think that if the Pentagon or the intelligence community had any dirt that they could throw at David Grusch to discredit him, we'd know it by now? But what happens when the president, the Pentagon, the White House press secretary, when Lockheed Martin, when all of these institutions are confronted about Mr. Grusch's allegations? What do? They run and hide. What's going on? That's the point, I think, at which media curiosity ought to be being twigged. Because back during the Watergate days, as Bob Woodward told me when I met him probably 15, 20 years ago, they were ignored. He and Carl Bernstein's stories were ignored for months by a lot of the other media. And as you and I both know, often in the media, when somebody goes out on a limb and starts running a series of stories that are questionably controversial, a lot of the media think to themselves, gosh, I hope they crash and burn on those stories. You know, it's going to be great fun to see the New York Times come a cropper on that series of stories. And the interesting thing was what happened with Watergate was the sheer weight of evidence eventually brought the other media on board. And a large part of the reason why the media jumped on board was because the Congress began engaging with the story. Mm-hmm. It realized these allegations were true, and witnesses were compelled to give evidence before Senate and congressional committees, which eventually brought the truth to light. And it was only at that point, when the Congress started doing its job, that the media went, oh, hell, Woodward and Bernstein are right after all. We better start doing stories. And that's what fascinates me, because we're now at that very same moment in history with this allegation.
Absolutely.
If David Grusch is not telling the truth, if he's somehow some whack job who's made up these allegations, I'm happy to eat humble pie and admit that he's wrong. But the only way that he can be demonstrated to be wrong is if the Pentagon, intelligence community, and defense community are properly put on the spot and his allegations are tested. And I can tell you, already inside the Congress, there are corroborative witnesses who have come forward and corroborated serious aspects of Mr. Grusch's story. And it's not me saying this. Mark my words. It's Senator Marco Rubio who's saying this. He has acknowledged that first-hand witnesses with very high security clearances from senior levels of the US government have already come forward and given evidence in the last 2 years. So that's the thing that I do find puzzling. I think the media have done what they did. For example, I mean, at risk again of being controversial, it's slowly coming out, for example, that there were gain-of-function experiments at the Wuhan laboratory. Mm-hmm. Yes, a lot of the anti-vax comments are ridiculous, but one of the things that has consistently been pushed aside by progressive left media, including a lot of the mainstream media, has been the suggestion that there might have been improper experiments with gain-of-function that were in part perhaps US-funded by the National Health Institute at Wuhan. And it's now a matter of public record that that was the case. And certain journalists who were making contrarian claims to those being pushed by mainstream media were essentially isolated and marginalized. Yeah. And it's really interesting. One of the things that's happening at the moment, I think, is the very weakness of mainstream media, because it is so under-resourced, is that it's becoming excessively reliant on one or two key sources in defense and intelligence. Because a lot of these big stories that you see that are given so much play in the big legacy newspapers, they all come from one or two sources. Yeah. And those newspapers are terrified of losing those sources, because to lose those stories is to lose what they perceive as the cachet that gives their newspapers the edge over their rivals.
Yeah, a lot of the scoops that they get are due to the fact that they have these cozy relationships with the sources inside the Pentagon.
And if their sources are saying, if their sources are saying to them, as I suspect they are, listen, I wouldn't be risking your reputation on these Dave Grusch allegations. His chickens are going to come home to roost. I'd just let those ones go. I suspect there's that kind of dampening down happening behind the scenes. There's no good explanation for why the Grey Lady, the New York Times, or indeed the Washington Post are not deploying teams of investigative journalists onto this issue. Why is 60 Minutes CBS so soft on this issue when the highest rating story in their history is a story that they did on UAPs?
And that was a fair shot, I thought. I mean, they did a good job.
It was a fair shot.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think ultimately all David Grusch is asking for is a fair shot.
Exactly.
All he's asking for is for his allegations to be tested before the Congress in a public way. And I think the real proof of the pudding will come the moment when the rest of the media decides it has or has not to engage, is when his allegations are properly tested in a public forum before the Congress. And look, frankly, I suspect he is telling the truth because I've got corroborative witnesses who are telling me that he's telling me the truth. And Senator Marco Rubio is saying that he's got corroborative witnesses who are first-hand witnesses as well. And I know from other Congress people and senators who are telling me privately that they also know that there is smoke where there is fire.
Well, it seems like it passes the smell test when you look at the reaction of the senators and Congress. I mean, they wouldn't act this way. They wouldn't spend resources. They wouldn't have briefings. Their staff wouldn't be elated about it, or excited about it. You hear Cory Booker's quote that I don't know that much about it, but my staff is totally crazy about it. Yeah, because they know something is going on here, and they wouldn't be acting that way unless there was some.
And let me explain to you why this is getting political momentum right now. The reason it's getting even more political momentum right now is because both Gillibrand and Rubio are presidential aspirants, and they know that there are votes in revealing what needs to be revealed.
Yeah,
that's why this is becoming a political imperative.
Well, and I think that there's a balance to be struck by both Democrats and Republicans. Both parties are making sure that they have someone in the mix here, because if this comes up and there's this 50-year, 70-year, shadow government like catastrophe, neither Democrats or Republicans want to be on the side of the Pentagon in that response. So they want to be on the side that's uncovering things.
Sure. And so to address the issue that you raised, yes, there has been a lot of nonsense spewed on social media, especially since the wacky days of the January 6th insurrection, the QAnon allegations. I'm a huge fan of a BBC series at the moment that investigates conspiracies, including the January 6th story. And it explores how QAnon developed. And it's quite scary. It's quite scary how this cancer of lies developed and metastasized, including inside some media that ran stories quite recklessly that they shouldn't have run. But it's also, the corollary is true. There have been stories that have been suppressed that ought to have been investigated because the media has become far too cautious about investigating, because, frankly, at the bottom of this is resources, budgets. I mean, I'm doing what I'm doing as a freelancer. I'm not getting paid by anyone to do this work. And frankly, it's probably a good thing because it makes me freer to say and think what I do. But the reality is that news editors who assign investigative journalists like myself, they know that I'm investigative and I cost a lot of money. It takes months to do the kind of work that I do. It's different from news journalism. News journalists just report what's happening in the daily news cycle. Investigative journalists have to go out and discover and work sources. That costs an enormous amount of money because often you have to go and see those sources and sit down with them and hold them hand and persuade them to talk. And so that takes months. It can take years. It has taken years in my case. And yeah, I mean, I think that ultimately I've reached a conclusion based on the sheer weight of corroborative evidence that other media haven't reached because they haven't done the homework. But I think we're now at a stage where if I was a news editor in an investigative legacy news organization, I would be saying, surely to heavens, it's time for us to start tasking our journalists to start asking questions. I mean, there was a turning point on the weekend when the Miami newspaper that is in Senator Rubio's hometown, they gave coverage in their mainstream newspaper to Senator Rubio's comments on UAPs. So that's one of the biggest newspapers in the Florida Panhandle. I think it was the Miami Times or the Miami Herald.
Yeah.
It's very significant that a legacy major newspaper has given that issue coverage. And it's interesting because, just to tip my hat for a moment, there's a very courageous female journalist who I've met and spoken to who began some of the original investigations into Jeffrey Epstein in Miami. And her newspaper gave her the opportunity to break those stories. And it was really interesting because it was a newspaper outside of the Washington, New York establishment that started breaking open the story of the absolutely disgraceful criminality of Jeffrey Epstein. Yeah. And to this day, it's still digging. And she's a courageous young woman. I wish I could remember her name. But what really struck me as a really important moment in journalism was to see how the Epstein story, it wasn't broken by somebody on the New York Times or the Washington Post. It was broken by a local newspaper in the town of in the area of Florida, in Miami, that heard about Jeffrey Epstein's crimes from individual victims. And so what's going to happen, I think, eventually is you're going to see this story, I think, on UAPs is probably going to be the death knell for legacy media. Because what's happening is shows like yours, shows like mine, which is a vodcast called Need to Know.
Absolutely.
We're devoting resources and time to investigating an issue that is largely being ignored and overlooked by the legacy media. And the interesting thing is that, you know, a lot of the big scoops, a lot of the big stories, they start with news services like ours. And that's because the news media and the legacy media fail to do their job. Because for all their huff and their puff, they're as limited as we are by resources. And the decision to allocate resources to covering an issue about UAPs is molded often by the perceptions and the biases of a certain middle-aged or elderly editor who has a worldview that has been formed by the disinformation that lies at the heart of this story. Absolutely. It's one of the fundamental allegations of David Grusch that disinformation has deterred the news media in the United States from engaging on this issue since at least the 1950s. Yeah. And it's quite clear, even when you do your own historical research. When I did my book, In Plain Sight, I was shocked to discover that there was a deliberate policy decision made by the CIA at the time of the Robertson panel to disinform and lie to the American public and to try and explain away as much UAP phenomena as possible prosaically, even though there was no prosaic explanation that actually fit. Yeah. The American public have been victims of an intelligence operation that has been run against them for at least 50, 60, 70 years. And the interesting thing is the Church Commission made that illegal. Again, another good reason for legacy media to start asking questions. Yeah. So look, I'm trying to make an excuse here for why the legacy media has failed. It has failed because, frankly, it's not as resourced as you'd like to think it would be. Even big shows like 60 Minutes. I worked for the Australian equivalent of CBS 60 Minutes. And shows like mine were constrained by budget realities. TV advertising revenue is in serious decline. Newspapers no longer have the rivers of gold advertisements that they used to have. A lot of that money is disappearing online, making bloated plutocrats like those who run Meta, Facebook, Google. All of those big institutions are making an absolute killing from providing dross online that has no serious commitment to quality journalism. Yeah. What we're seeing here isn't the fault of the legacy media. It's the fault of the diminution of the power of legacy media as a result of the resurgence, the rise of Google, Facebook, Meta, Twitter, all of these institutions that sadly, because of algorithms, give amplification to lies.
Yeah. And we haven't found our balance yet. I mean, eventually, hopefully it'll balance out. But
yeah, ultimately what lies behind my passion about this subject is a belief in quality journalism, objective, rigorous journalism. And that's what's needed here. And I plead, really at the moment, legacy media are in a bind because I think they are so limited by how much they can allocate of their budgets. If they start asking questions, the moment legacy media start pushing at the edifice of the lies that have been told about UAPs for much of the last 60, 70, 80 years, that edifice will begin to crumble. Congress itself is waiting for leadership from the legacy media. And we're at a point in history where you had the Washington Post, a plucky little post, chipping away day after day after day with stories about the Watergate scandal, and it was largely being ignored by much of the legacy media. And then all of a sudden, it started bobbing up in Congress, and that's where we're at now. The big question is Congress going to do its job?
Yeah.
I'm not yet 100% convinced that they are, but let's just wait and see. We're at a really important tipping point in history. And if people watching this want to make a difference, they can let their congressperson know. You know, it's really important that politicians be put on notice that they know that people care about this issue. Because it's so easy to marginalize. It's so easy to marginalize this. It's so easy to push it to another plate and say, oh, this is just tinfoil hat nonsense. But if the allegations of David Grusch are true, then there are technologies that could fix our fossil fuel problem overnight.
Speaking of congressmen, I have Congressman Jared Huffman, who I interview quite regularly on my show, and I've asked him the question, and he kind of, I think I shocked him with the question. He kind of blinked his eyes and was like, oh, that's just, not real, basically, is what he told me. And I'm itching to talk to him again so I can repose the question to him as this moves further along. And I'm anxious for the time when he kind of like does a double take and says, well, what I said before was wrong. And hopefully that will occur.
It's funny. I noticed Michael Shermer, who's I think a skeptic I respect.
Yeah.
I respect and admire Michael Shermer. And he went on Coast to Coast recently. And he, I think for the first time, acknowledged the possibility that he might be wrong with his dismissiveness of Mr. Grusch's allegations. And he conveyed his willingness to accept the possibility that governments do lie and that they do deceive. And so, I think we're starting to see cracks in the edifice.
Yeah.
And it's a tough thing to admit that you're wrong. I mean, I've been wrong on stories. Journalists get things wrong all the time. We do get things wrong.
Absolutely.
And what we have to do is admit that we get things wrong, apologize, and move on. The interesting thing in this case is Mr. Grusch hasn't even been given the opportunity yet to be allowed to put his evidence because his evidence is classified. It's secret. And the only body that has the power to declassify his evidence so that he can be allowed to be given evidence in public hearings is the Congress. That's
it always goes back to the Congress and what they're going to do. That's where we stand. And from
it's funny because I love your Constitution in America. I love the way it enshrines the power of the Congress. It puts the Congress and the president as the commander-in-chief above the entire executive government structure. And ultimately, every arm of government is responsible to Congress. And it's that separation of powers. It's that delineation of who is responsible and who's boss that makes your Congress so powerful. Now, it's been riven and stricken with weakness in the past few years, but imagine if what Mr. Grusch is saying is true. Just for a moment, entertain the possibility that what he's saying is true. If what he's saying is true, we are at a tipping point, a paradigm change in world history. Right. Firstly, it means we're not alone. And secondly, it means that there are technologies that your government has access to, which it's been improperly, illegally withholding from the knowledge of the Congress.
Yeah, the trust in government is going to suffer. And I can understand that's being part of the resistance to disclosure.
Yeah, it's a really shocking situation. And I sincerely hope that we can get to the truth of what's going on. And nobody would be happier than I if it turns out that this is secret American technology. Because if there's one country in the world out of America, Russia, and China that I want to have this technology, it would be America.
Yeah, I think it's given those three.